For Week 3 of the 2016 season, this is the College Football Traveler. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the College Football Traveler, the show where we talk about everything college football. I'm your host RJ, let's get to it.
The final score.
All right, this is the final score, the segment where we go over last week's games involving the top 25, what happened in my must-see majors from last week, and how the CFP Quick Picks turned out. Last week's scores fall into something of two camps. One, the jump out wins versus the slow starts. In the first category, the jump out wins. Number 3, Florida State hosted Charleston Southern. The Seminoles led 28-0 at the end of the first quarter and ended up winning the game 52-8. Number 5, Michigan led 21-0 over University of Central Florida by the end of the first quarter, closing that game out 51-14. Number 6, Houston led 28-0 at the half against Lamar and pitched a shutout, closing 42-0. At number 13, Louisville headed to Syracuse, where the Cardinals led 28-7 at the end of the first quarter. Louisville would end the rout 62-28 in a game in which quarterback Lamar Jackson threw for 411 yards. The Louisville receiving corps yielded 431 yards with a 20.5 average. And finally, in the jump out wins, number 20, Texas A&M led 17-0 at the end of the first half against Prairie View A&M, a game that ended up 67-0. On the other side of the coin, in the slow starts category, number 1, Alabama only led 10-3 in the first quarter against Western Kentucky in a game that they ended up winning 38-10. Number 2, Clemson was tied 3-3 at home against Troy and only led at the half 13-10. Clemson would go on to win that game 30-24. Up in Columbus, number 4, Ohio State was tied with Tulsa at the end of the first quarter 3-3. The Buckeyes would go on to win that game 48-3. Number 8, Washington led 7-0 against Idaho at the end of the first quarter. The Huskies would go on to win that game 59-14. In one of the weekend's biggest stunners, number 9, Georgia led FCS Nichols 7-0 at the end of the first quarter and 10-7 at the half. The Bulldogs would barely hold on to victory, winning 26-24. At number 11, Texas had a slow start of their own, leading UTEP 10-0 at the end of the first quarter. Texas would go on to win that game 41-7. Number 15, TCU was trailing 3-0 to Arkansas at the end of the first quarter in a game they would end up losing in double overtime 41-38. Number 16, Iowa led Iowa State 14-3 going into the second quarter. The Hawkeyes would then pull away, ending the game 42-3. In the first quarter, I'm sure all Irish fans would like to forget, number 18, Notre Dame was tied with Nevada 0-0. The Irish would go on to win 39-10. Number 19, Ole Miss dragged in its home opener against Wofford, leading only 10-0 at the end of the first quarter. Ole Miss would go on to win that game 38-13. Number 21, LSU was tied at the end of the first quarter with Jacksonville State 0-0. Tigers would end up winning 34-13. Number 23, Baylor was down 6-0 to SMU at the end of the first quarter, tied 6-6 at the half, but after some adjustments, the Bears won the game 40-13. Up in Eugene, number 24, Oregon led Virginia 13-6 at the end of the first quarter. Oregon would go on to win that game 44-26. And finally, number 25, Miami was tied 0-0 with Florida Atlantic at the end of the first quarter. The Hurricanes would close that game 38-10. Of the slow starts, most were likely being complacent. Alabama, Ohio State, Washington. Final scores clearly reflect that the opponents just couldn't match up all game, and it's likely that the players knew this. I'll use Alabama as an example. In 2014, in a game that ended 48-14, the Crimson Tide led Western Carolina 10-7 at the half, and in 2013, Alabama only led Colorado State 7-0 at the end of the first quarter, but would go on to win 31-6. So it's fair to say there's something of a trend for these second week or home opener easy game matchups. However, that being said, a good team or a sleeper can take advantage of the lack of the mental focus that these teams have shown that they possess. The game between Michigan and Appalachian State 9 years ago proves a point. Also looking closer at Clemson, while 30-24 against Troy might make some Tigers fan nervous, I'll compare them to last year's games. Last year, Clemson beat Louisville 20-17, Notre Dame 24-22, Florida State 23-13, South Carolina 37-32, and in the ACC championship against North Carolina, Clemson won 45-37. In other words, 30-24 is not a new development for the Tigers, but rather seems to be the way they play the game. Looking back over last week's must-see majors, the game at 7 o'clock didn't disappoint. At the end of the first quarter, Arkansas led 3-0, and by 13 at the half, TCU comes back in the fourth quarter, scoring 21 points to take the lead, but not so fast, my friends. Arkansas scores late, making the 2-point conversion to tie. TCU then gets the ball back, marches all the way down the field, where they attempt a 28-yard chip shot field goal that gets blocked by 6'10" lineman Dan Skipper. A touchdown each in the end of the first overtime. TCU kicks a field goal to start the second overtime, and with a 5-yard run, Arkansas quarterback Austin Allen scores the go-ahead touchdown, winning the game for the Razorbacks. At 9 o'clock was Texas Tech at Arizona State. State? I said there would be fireworks, and I was not wrong. 71 points scored in the first half. Arizona State ends up winning the game 68-55. In my quick picks for week 2, my straight up win percentage went up from 80.95 to 86.36, but I got destroyed against the spread, going from a 62.5% down to 51.52. It's hard to win in a week when the biggest spread is 46.5, and teams like Clemson, which are favored by 36, end up winning by only 6, and 3 touchdown favorites like Oklahoma State end up losing, but overall I'm still doing a little better than chance.
This week in the polls.
Alright, this is This Week in the Polls, where we go over the developments in the AP Top 25. At number 1, still, University of Alabama, up 1 spot from last week. Florida State at number 2, Ohio State at number 3, and Michigan at number 4. Down 3 spots, Clemson takes number 5. At number 6, 7, and 8, Houston, Stanford, and Washington hold their spots respectively. At number 9 is Wisconsin, up 1 spot from last week. Louisville jumps 3 spots to take the number 10 slot. And Texas and Michigan State hold steady at 11 and 12 respectively. Iowa comes in at number 13, up 3 spots from last week. Oklahoma holds its position at number 14. Tennessee is up 2 spots to number 15 this week. And down 7 spots, the University of Georgia comes in at number 16. Up 3 spots this week, Texas A&M comes in at number 17. At numbers 18 and 19, Notre Dame and Ole Miss hold steady. After dropping all the way to 21, LSU is up 1 spot this week to 20. Baylor moves up 2 spots to number 21, along with Oregon at 22. After dropping out of the rankings in week 1, Florida is back in at number 23. Arkansas joins the rankings for the first time this year at 24. And holding steady at number 25 is the University of Miami. I've decided to title This Week in the Polls, The Garage Sale for Houston. It's clear that the ranking agencies have sold out on the idea that if Houston wins out, they're going to have to be led into the playoffs. Of the top 5, numbers 2 and 5 and 3 and 5 play each other. The Pac-12 threatens at 7 and 8, but there's a guaranteed loss between them, and even if Wisconsin beats both Ohio State and Michigan, and Louisville beats Florida State and Clemson, and Houston gets jumped by both teams, Houston is still ranked 3rd or 4th. It will take one of 3 Big Ten teams going undefeated, one of the Pac-12 North teams going undefeated, Alabama going undefeated, and Texas going undefeated for Houston to get left all the way out of the playoffs. Louisville and Houston play each other in the second to last game of the season, so it can't be Louisville to keep Houston out if Houston goes undefeated all the way, and it's certainly a tall order given what has already happened in college football this year for all of that to occur. So with the probability that Houston goes undefeated needing a contingency plan, what are the rankings going to do? Well, a Power 5 conference, specifically a Power 5 champion, will have to get triaged out of the playoffs, and I think they've already started doing that. I'm going to go ahead and say that the ranking agencies believe that the Big Ten will get a guaranteed playoff spot. Just look at the rankings. Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Iowa, all top 15 teams, and they all moved up with the exception of Michigan State, who stayed at number 12 from last week. And holy quality wins, Batman. Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State are all in the same division. Between the 3 of them, they will have played the other 2 teams even before the conference championship multiple times. And Michigan plays all 4 of the other ranked Big Ten teams in the regular season. I think the ACC is also in according to the Week 3 rankings. Florida State, Clemson, and Louisville are all top 10. And who is really going to challenge them? The real threat for the ACC's playoff spot is within itself, and the rankings know that. I think the rankings are hedging on Clemson, who have to play Florida State, currently ranked number 2, and both Florida State and Clemson have to play Louisville, who rank at number 10. Of the 3 ACC schools, FSU looks the best right now, having beaten Ole Miss in Week 1 and handling Charleston Southern 52-8, whereas Clemson wins against Troy only 30-24. Louisville looks good and is climbing, but they weren't preseason 1 or 2, so they're going to get left out until they beat both Florida State and Clemson. And finally, in the ACC, I think they're setting up Louisville. If Louisville wins out, they will have beaten the current number 2 team and number 5, and currently ranked 10 will likely keep the ACC in a playoff spot. If they win the entirety of the regular season, they will have also beaten current number 6, Houston, so it's fair to say that Louisville very much controls its own destiny. The SEC, once an untouchable conference, looks very precarious this season. Alabama is number 1, but the next SEC team doesn't come into the rankings until 15 with Tennessee, and the next SEC West team isn't until Texas A&M at 17. I think overall the SEC is getting punished for not living up to their number 1, 5, 9, and 11 preseason rankings. If they had swept Week 1, the SEC was golden, but they didn't, and now it looks like the other conferences will have to be at parity with no standout teams for a one-loss SEC team to get in. The Big Ten is sitting pretty, the ACC is dancing, and the SEC looks like it could be in trouble. Luckily for them, the Pac-12 is sitting right next to them on the cliff. Pac-12 North has teams at 7 and 8, but the next ranked team after that is number 22. I think that the Pac-12 as a whole is fighting the SEC as a whole and the Big 12 as a whole for one of the playoff spots. And the Big 12 is hurting right now. In fact, I'll go ahead and say that they're on life support and really are the first choice in the, quote, which conference champion is left out if Houston runs the table discussion. I mean, look at the conference top to bottom. Oklahoma already has one loss. Oklahoma State has a loss. TCU has a loss. Texas Tech, Kansas State, Iowa State, Kansas all have lost by week 2. In fact, Baylor, Texas, and West Virginia are the only undefeated teams in the Big 12, and only Baylor and Texas are ranked, with Texas being the highest at 11. Overall, I think the Big 12 is holding on for dear life to claim a conference championship playoff spot, especially given the preseason conference headliners OU and TCU both are 1-1 going into week 3. It could be worse though. The Pac-12 South is dead. There's not much to say here. No Pac-12 South team is ranked for the second week. USC, the preseason Pac-12 South favorite, was embarrassed in week 1, and their preseason rank at 20 was something of a spot loan that the ranking agencies gave to the division that they've now decided to call back in. Overall, I think it's fair to say that the AP has set up the playoff committee for the possibility that Houston wins out and arguably ought to have a spot in the playoffs.
Scouting report.
Here is this week's injury report. Number 2, Florida State. Backup quarterback Sean McGuire is listed as questionable for Saturday's game against Louisville. Offensive guard Kareem Ari also listed as questionable with concussion. Fullback Freddie Stevenson questionable with an ankle injury. Defensive tackle Darvin Taylor II questionable with a shoulder injury. Defensive tackle Adam Torres questionable with a foot injury. Defensive back Derwin James out indefinitely with a knee injury. And defensive back Nate Andrews is upgraded to probable with a calf injury. Overall, the quarterback situation at Florida State is beginning to look quite precarious. Number 3, Ohio State. Wide receiver Dontre Wilson, who was injured last game, is listed as probable against Oklahoma, and linebacker Dante Booker is upgraded to probable. Number 4, Michigan. Defensive end Taco Charlton is still listed as questionable with an ankle injury. Linebacker Noah Forbush, also listed as questionable with a leg injury. Cornerback Jordan Lewis, questionable as well with a back injury. Defensive tackle Brian Moan, also questionable with a leg injury. Struck with the undisclosed bug, cornerback David Long is listed as questionable. Running back Drake Johnson, listed as questionable. And running back Kareem Walker, also listed as questionable. Number 5, Clemson. Offensive lineman Chandler Reeves is expected to miss Saturday's game against South Carolina State with a knee injury, as well as defensive back Brian Dawkins. Linebacker Ben Boulware is expected to miss with an ankle injury. Cornerback Adrian Baker expected to miss with a knee injury. And wide receiver Hunter Renfro is expected to miss the next 4 weeks with a hand injury. The Tigers will certainly miss Renfro, who, as you recall, last year scored 2 touchdowns against Alabama in the national championship game. Number 6, Houston. Wide receiver Rashad Samples is listed as questionable with a concussion. Quarterback Greg Ward Jr., who missed last game, is listed as probable with a shoulder injury. Running back Duke Catalon, who also missed last game, is listed as probable with an ankle injury. And cornerback Brandon Wilson is listed as questionable with a leg injury. Number 7, Stanford. Backup running back Bryce Love is listed as questionable with a leg injury. And defensive end Harrison Phillips is listed as doubtful in Saturday's game against USC with a knee injury. Number 9, Wisconsin. Offensive lineman Dan Volz is out for the season with a knee injury. Linebacker Chris Orr out for the season with a leg injury. Offensive lineman George Panos out for the season with a shoulder injury. Offensive lineman John Dietzen is listed as questionable with a leg injury. Running back Corey Clement, who was injured last game, is listed as probable with an ankle injury. Natrell Jamerson is expected to miss 4 to 6 weeks with a leg injury. Number 10, Louisville. Wide receiver Jaquay Savage is listed as questionable with a shoulder injury in the game against Florida State. Number 11, Texas. Wide receiver Lorenzo Joe is out indefinitely with a hamstring injury. Offensive lineman Buck Major is out indefinitely with a finger injury. Running back Kirk Johnson is listed as questionable with a knee injury, and safety Dylan Haynes is listed as questionable as well with a head injury. Number 12, Michigan State. Linebacker Ed Davis is listed as probable versus Notre Dame with eligibility issues. Number 13, Iowa. Linebacker Parker Hess is listed as questionable in Saturday's game against North Dakota State with a hamstring injury, and center James Daniel is listed as doubtful with a knee injury. Number 14, Oklahoma. Bad news for Sooners fans. Wide receiver Dahu Green, listed as questionable with a concussion. Linebacker Tate Evans, who was injured last game, is listed as questionable with a hip injury. Defensive end Matt Diamond, upgraded to probable, having served a suspension. Running back Daniel Brooks, listed as questionable for undisclosed reasons. Defensive end DJ Ward, also listed as questionable with a neck injury. Defensive lineman Charles Walker, listed as questionable for undisclosed reasons. And defensive lineman Austin Roberts is upgraded to probable, having served a suspension. Number 15, Tennessee. Defensive lineman LaTroy Lewis is downgraded to expect to miss Saturday's game against Ohio with an ankle injury. Defensive back Evan Berry is listed as questionable with a hamstring injury. Linebacker Darren Kirkland Jr. is downgraded to expect to miss Saturday with an ankle injury. Number 16, Georgia. Defensive end Jonathan Ledbetter is out indefinitely on suspension. And safety Trent Fricks is questionable against Missouri with a foot injury. Number 18, Notre Dame. Running back Justin Brent is out indefinitely with a foot injury. Wide receiver Torrey Hunter Jr. is questionable against Michigan State with a concussion. Defensive back Sean Crawford is out for the season with an Achilles injury. And cornerback Nick Watkins is out indefinitely with an arm injury. Number 19, Ole Miss. Cornerback Kendarius Webster is out for the season with a knee injury. Running back Eric Swinney also out for the season with a knee injury. Offensive lineman Jeremy Liggins is listed as questionable with a suspension. Wide receiver DK Metcalf is out for the season with a foot injury. Tight end Taz Zettergren is questionable against Alabama for undisclosed reasons. And wide receiver Derek Jones is questionable for a suspension. Number 20, LSU. Running back Leonard Fournette is upgraded to probable against Mississippi State with an ankle injury, and guard Josh Butt is probable, having served his suspension. Number 21, Baylor. Cornerback Ryan Reed is listed as doubtful for Friday's game against Rice with an ankle injury. Wide receiver Pooh Strickland, questionable with a shoulder injury. Safety Chance Waz, probable with disciplinary reasons. Defensive back Travon Blanchard, upgraded to probable with a knee injury. And running back Shock Linwood, also probable with a neck injury. Number 23, Oregon. Offensive lineman Zach Oken is listed as questionable with a concussion. Linebacker Keulana Apelu is listed as questionable for undisclosed reasons. Tight end Josh Munt, questionable for a knee injury. Tight end Evan Bayless, questionable with a foot injury. And wide receiver Dylan Mitchell, questionable with a knee injury. Number 23, Florida. Wide receiver Dre Massey is out for the season with a knee injury. Wide receiver Khalif Jackson is questionable with a foot injury. Wide receiver Chris Thompson, questionable with a leg injury. Wide receiver Tyree Cleveland, expected to miss Saturday with a hamstring injury. Wide receiver Antonio Callaway, downgraded to doubtful against North Texas with a quad injury. Offensive lineman Tyler Jordan is listed as questionable for undisclosed reasons. And offensive lineman Fred Johnson is upgraded to probable with an ankle injury. Number 24, Arkansas. Running back DJ Hammonds is out indefinitely with a knee injury. Defensive back Kevin Richardson II out for the season with a pectoral injury. And defensive back Brito Tutt out for the season with an ACL injury. Number 25, Miami. Defensive lineman Cortell Jenkins is out indefinitely with a knee injury. Quarterback Tucker Bierne, questionable against Appalachian State with legal problems. Defensive back Adrian Colbert, listed as questionable with lower body issues. I guess his legs are falling off. And defensive lineman Chad Thomas is listed as probable with a shoulder injury.
College football headlines.
This week's college football headlines circle around one story coming out of Stillwater, Oklahoma, where last week the Oklahoma State Cowboys were upset by Central Michigan on what turned out to be an improper ruling by the officiating crew. With just seconds left to play, Oklahoma State quarterback Mason Rudolph threw a pass to the sidelines and was called for intentional grounding as no receiver was anywhere near the area. Even though time had expired, the officials ruled that the loss of down penalty gave the Chippewas one untimed down. With 42 yards to go, Michigan threw a Hail Mary, which was caught, then completed a lateral near the goal line in for a touchdown. This turn of events revealed a plethora of NCAA rule experts in Stillwater, Oklahoma, who discovered that, as an exception to the general rule that no game ends on a penalty, in the event that a penalty results in a loss of downs, with time expired, the game simply ends. After review, the MAC officiating crew admitted that they made an incorrect call, but despite efforts to change the game's outcome, the Chippewas' upset of the Cowboys will stand. Oklahoma State Athletic Director Mike Holder had this to say: "We contacted everyone that could help us understand the situation and do something to change the outcome. We were told that there was nothing that could be done about the official's error at the end of the game, and the result is final. In my mind, it is incomprehensible that a mistake made after time had expired cannot be corrected. The final score shows that Oklahoma State lost the game, but that doesn't mean that I have to agree with it." Close quote. The officials in that game have been suspended from officiating, but I doubt this is the last we'll hear of it.
On the gridiron. Top 25 rundown.
Here's this week's Top 25 rundown, a listing of every game involving a Top 25 ranked team. On Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Central, it's number 6 Houston at Cincinnati. On Friday at 7, number 21 travels to Rice. On Saturday at 11 o'clock, number 15 Tennessee hosts Ohio. Number 5 Clemson hosts South Carolina State. Number 2 Florida State travels to number 10 Louisville. College game day alert. Number 13 Iowa hosts North Dakota State. Number 9 Wisconsin hosts Georgia State. And number 25 Miami travels to Appalachian State. At 2:30, number 4 Michigan plays Colorado in the Big House. Number 22 Oregon travels to Nebraska. Number 1 Alabama heads to Vaught Hemingway Stadium to play number 19 Ole Miss. At 6 p.m., number 20 LSU hosts Mississippi State. Number 17 Texas A&M travels to Auburn. At 6:30, number 24 Arkansas hosts Texas State. Number 23 Florida hosts North Texas. Number 12 Michigan State heads to number 18 Notre Dame. Number 16 Georgia travels to Missouri. Number 3 Ohio State heads to Norman to play number 14 Oklahoma. And number 7 Stanford hosts USC at 7 p.m. Wrapping up the top 25, number 11 Texas plays at Cal at 9:30.
Must-see majors.
All right, this is the must-see majors where I go through the best games at the prime 11 o'clock, 2:30, 7, and 9 o'clock slots for the week. I watched True Grit and Open Range this weekend, but I had a little bit of fun this week. Here we go. Will the clock strike high noon for Cinderella? Thursday at 6:30, it's Houston at Cincinnati. When the smoke clears, will it be the Gunslingers still standing or the Comeback Kids? Saturday at 11, it's Florida State versus Louisville. Is Alabama in a must-win situation? Saturday at 2:30, the Crimson Tide play Ole Miss as the SEC's playoff chances hang in the balance. Could this be the Big 12's last stand? Saturday at 6:30, Ohio State travels to Oklahoma. And finally, will the Longhorns be California dreaming or riding into the sunset? Saturday at 9, it's Texas at Cal, where the boys in burnt orange need a non-conference statement win to keep their playoff hopes alive.
DVR starting lineup.
This week's DVR starting lineup is all about getting in some good last-minute comparison games before the meat of conference play finally begins. We're 8 weeks from the playoff committee releasing their first rankings, but I think they will lean pretty heavily on how these first few weeks turn out to make their broad brush grouping decisions. Here's what I mean by the grouping decisions. According to the rules, each committee member creates a list of 30 teams he or she believes to be the best in the country. Of those teams, if any are listed by 3 or more members, they remain in consideration. After that, each member will list what they think are the best 6 teams in no particular order. 6 teams receiving the most votes will comprise the first group of the ranking step. This is called the listing step. In the first ranking step, each member will rank those 6 teams, 1 through 6, 1 being the best. The best team in each member's rankings will receive 1 point, second best receives 2, and so on. All of the members' rankings will be added together, and the 3 teams receiving the fewest points will become the top 3 seeds. The 3 teams that were not seeded will be held over for the next ranking step. Each member then will again list the 6 best teams remaining in the pool in no particular order, and 3 teams receiving the most votes from that group will be added to the 3 teams held over to comprise the next rank. They repeat steps 3 and 4 until 25 teams have been seeded. From the playoff committee selection protocol, paragraph number 3, so, to start, each committee member will use the eye test to put in their top 6 teams. Then the committee as a whole will set the order for 1 through 3, then again and again, and so on, until they drill all the way down on who they think should be ranked where inside of what group. So, what do they look at when they make these decisions? Well, the protocol states essentially as much information as possible. That doesn't really say much. In economics, there's a term called revealed preferences, which basically means that no matter what you say is important at the outset, I can look at your decisions to determine the truth of what you think is really important. So while as much information sounds good, I'm going to lean on what the committee uses to make actual head-to-head comparisons as the model for how they will make their general grouping decisions. So for the committee, when it comes down to putting profile next to profile, the quote tiebreakers of the selection process, and I'm quoting the protocol now, for distinguishing among otherwise comparable teams is 1. Conference championships won, 2. Strength of schedule, 3. Head-to-head competition, 4. Comparative outcomes of common opponents without incenting margin of victory, basically the score doesn't matter, and 5. Other relevant factors such as key injuries that may have affected a team's performance during the season or likely will affect its postseason performance. I think this is what the committee will use throughout the selection process, not just during the head-to-head comparisons. The key for these first few weeks is that 3rd and 4th bullets, head-to-head and comparative outcomes of common opponents. In other words, where your team lands in the first rankings will depend on who your team beat and who else beat those teams. Now, what about preseason rankings? Again, from the protocol, quote, while it is understood that committee members will take into consideration all kinds of data, including polls, committee members will be required to discredit polls wherein initial rankings are established before competition has occurred. So basically, preseason rankings don't matter, but your ranking after the preseason can. Not necessarily that they do, just that they can, which is what I alluded to during This Week in the Poll segment. The ranking agencies are essentially setting up the grouping decisions for the committee. They don't need to be precise, just broad brushstrokes for the initial groupings, which is why I think you can see patterns in how the conferences and divisions are getting treated. So with that, I'll use this week's DVR starting lineup as an opportunity to validate and test presumptions and assumptions, as well as make notes for comparing teams for the rest of the season. This week's DVR starting lineup is full of yardstick games. My first game is number 25 Miami at Appalachian State. This game allows you to put the Week 1 Tennessee game in perspective. It pits an SEC East performance against an ACC Coastal performance of a common opponent. Number 2, Pitt at Oklahoma State. Pitt dominated Penn State, and Oklahoma State was upset on an errant call against a Group of 5 team. This game gives a good Big 12, Big 10, ACC three-way link-up. Third, I'm picking number 12 Michigan State versus number 18 Notre Dame. Michigan State will play Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, all after this game. And Notre Dame plays Syracuse, which allows for comparisons to Louisville in the ACC, Stanford, a link to the Pac-12, and USC, which is another Pac-12 link, plus comparisons to Alabama. This is another good three-way link game between the Big 10, Big 12, and Pac-12. Notre Dame's performance against Texas Week 1 and future performance against a lot of ACC and Pac-12 teams, as well as Michigan State's future performance, in Big 10 conference play, will go a long way in the common opponent department. Being an independent, Notre Dame has a good spiderweb schedule that ties a lot of teams together. Really, they're kind of the barometer team for college football, and I'd venture to guess that the playoff committee leans pretty heavily on how Notre Dame fares against its schedule in making its grouping decisions as well as head-to-head ranking decisions. And finally, for my DVR starting lineup, I'm picking Texas A&M at Auburn. Texas A&M played UCLA Week 1. That's a Pac-12 connection. And Auburn played Clemson. That's an ACC connection. So while you could already do an SEC West to UCLA and an SEC East to Clemson comparison, now you can put an SEC West team against Clemson and an SEC East team against UCLA with second-order common opponent comparisons. It's probably less reliable than head-to-head or common opponent games, but I can see the committee using them if it really came down to it. Well, alright folks, that's it for week 3. As always, you can get my College Football Traveler #CFBT Quick Picks on the Twitter @CFBTraveler, all one word. Check out where I'm going by following the Instagram @CFBTraveler, all one word. And keep up with everything going on with the show on the Facebook page, College Football Traveler. This week I'm headed to Oxford to check out Alabama versus Ole Miss. Oxford is one of my favorite college football destinations for a ton of reasons. It's almost worth giving it its own show to talk about, which is what I'm going to do. So with that, I'm your host, RJ. I'll see you out there.